Hello. This is going to be the last evolution lecture with regards to chapter 17. And it's all about convergent evolution. And rather than just talking a whole bunch, I'm going to just get started. Convergent evolution is a phenomenon where animals that are not closely related at all come to look totally alike, right? And we've talked about this a little bit before. So, why is it in the first place that animals look the way they do? So why do dogs look like dogs, for example? Well, in animal bodies, form always follows function, right? Canines are land carnivores that need to capture prey. They live in flat, open areas with not very many hills for the most part. You don't really find forest dogs or mountain dogs, right? The body plan of dogs, at least like we're talking about wolves in this case, because some dogs live in different environments, but the body plan happens to work very well for catching swift prey that lives in this type of environment. So you look at the dog skeleton, and it seems like kind of random, but in all actuality, everything about it, the length of its tail, the length of its snout, the length of its legs, the way it has large muscle groups in some areas, smaller muscle groups in other areas, is all evolved to help it be successful in its environment, which is to catch prey and gather resources and all those other things. So one component of convergent evolution is isolation and convergence. As animals become isolated on different land masses, they begin to speciate, so they branch off into different groups or taxa. So since the time of dinosaurs, for example, mammals have evolved into 5,000 unique species spread over every continent except Antarctica. But across these land masses, two land masses may be completely cut off from each other. The animals from one side evolve totally independently from the animals on the other side. But those land masses still might have very similar environments. And convergent evolution is the process where organisms that are not closely related to each other independently evolve similar characteristics as a result of having to adapt to similar environments or niches. Because remember, it's natural selection, right? Nature selects these traits. The traits show up incrementally, randomly through mutations. But it's the ability of that trait to be successful in nature that determines whether or not it will get passed on. We looked at this photo before. One of these is Australia, one of these is North America. And I don't actually even remember which one is which, and that's kind of the point. They are so similar to each other. And here we have the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, and I don't have a picture of a wolf to show you, but they look so similar because they live in similar environments. One of these is the skeleton of a thylacine. The other is the skeleton of a Tasmanian tiger. I actually don't remember which is which, and that's kind of the point. When you look at their skulls, they're so incredibly similar to one another. A similar process to convergent evolution is called parallel evolution. So this is where two species that do share a fairly recent common ancestor evolve a single trait, a similar singular trait, right? So many species of insects, independent of one another, have evolved flight. Like dragonflies and flies are not branched directly off of each other. They got their wings totally separate from one another. And same with butterflies, right? The butterfly wing, the dragonfly wing, the fly wing, all evolved completely separate of each other. Convergent evolution is different because it's more extreme. It involves an entire body plan. So it's not just one single trait, it's many, many, many traits being kind of copied. And especially it'll evolve completely different kinds of animals. A little bit more on why convergent evolution occurs. As Darwin saw, many different environments on different land masses are not that different from each other, actually. And certain body plans that animals have are highly successful. Convergent evolution, here's the key though, convergent evolution can only happen if animals do not compete against each other. Because if two animals try to occupy the same niche in the same environment, they compete, and one of them is going to get driven out or go extinct. We call that the competitive exclusion principle, and we talked about that at length a very long time ago at the beginning of the year. So, for example, ichthyosaurs never competed with dolphins. Ichthyosaurs went extinct way before dolphins ever evolved on Earth. So that's why dolphins can sort of occupy the same niche currently that ichthyosaurs did in the past. And the Tasmanian tiger, the thylacine, never competed with wolves. Wolves never lived in Australia, and they never did in the past, they don't now. A couple examples of parallel evolution. First, the most recent common ancestor of dolphins and whales, they belong to the same group called cetaceans, but they each independently of one another have lost their hind limbs. An animal millions of years ago that we could consider a dolphin, an ancestor millions of years ago that we would have considered a true dolphin, and another ancestor millions of years ago that we would have considered a true whale, they each still had remnants of their hind legs, whereas today, as they've evolved separate from each other, they no longer have any hind legs whatsoever. So here we see, this might be a Dorudon. I don't exactly remember which extinct marine mammal this is, but it has little remnants of hind legs, but dolphins and whales have none whatsoever today. Large rostrums, which is your nose, right? Those have evolved independently in many different unrelated animals for unrelated reasons. So we have a tapir, an elephant, what's called the proboscis monkey, an elephant shrew, and an elephant lion, right? Or, I'm sorry, an elephant seal. I was thinking sea lion. They each have a big schnoz, and it's for a completely different reason in each of them. In one, it's for to be prehensile, the elephant. In the elephant seal, it's to make a really gross noise. I think it helps them vocalize. Proboscis monkey, I'm not really sure. Elephant shrew, it probably helps them smell. And I don't know what tapirs use it for either. Maybe to help them smell also. I'm gonna still talk about the thylacine for a little bit to highlight just this point about common ancestry way back in the past. So their common ancestor lived in a time period on Earth known as the Triassic, which was around 170 million years ago, an extremely long time ago. Their common ancestor of these two animals that look just like each other in the present, although thylacines are extinct now, but they were alive only about 100 years ago. Their common ancestor looked absolutely nothing like either animal, right? So, and then it branched off, and then those branching animals would have looked absolutely nothing like a wolf or a thylacine, and then millions and millions and millions of years of evolution, eventually two branches way at the end of that tree converged sort of to the same point. Thylacines are marsupials, right? Their closest relatives are kangaroos, koalas, and wombats, and wolves are canines, but they got pretty much identical body designs and features. So here's the thylacine again. Here's the animal that wolves and thylacines would have shared common ancestry with, the Lystrosaurus, which actually isn't a mammal, it's a synapsid, the animals with one hole in their skull that we talked about a while ago. Now this animal is so bizarre, a beak, tusks, it doesn't really have paws, it has sort of almost like fingers on its hands and feet. Extremely, extremely bizarre. Not really a mammal, right? Marsupials are extremely ancient types of mammals, and then the placental mammals, which is what most mammals are, placental mammals. So their common ancestor would have been radically different because even though they're both mammals, they have evolved down very different pathways. So you get something like this. This is the oldest, the oldest fossil we have of a true marsupial. I'm not going to try to pronounce that name. Looks like this guy, and it's 125 million years old. Looks kind of like a shrew with a mouse, but a very large mouth, right? So that's also really nothing like the thylacine, but over a period of 125 million years, with slight modifications generation after generation, yeah, you can change that into a thylacine, no problem. Another example, the marsupial lion was another Australian mammal that evolved to look like another mammal, which is large cats. They weren't cats, they were marsupials, right? But they both had retractable claws. No other marsupial ever evolved that trait. They had the short faces that we associate with big cats, and they had large incisors too. So here's the skull of a lion on the left, and the skull of a marsupial lion on the right. Very, very similar in terms of the way the skull is shaped, the teeth, although the marsupial lion has very odd molars, which are one gigantic meat cleaver like molar, right? But we can see the similarities. Here's what they may have looked like with all their fur and everything. One really odd thing, couple odd things here about marsupial lions is they didn't have paws. They had again, kind of like hands in a way. And this illustration doesn't really do it justice, but their thumb claw was really gigantic. It was many times larger than any of the other ones. New Zealand, Australia, Antarctica, Europe, Madagascar, Africa, South America, and New Guinea. Each of these land masses either still have or in the recent past had their own large flightless birds. And the odd thing is all of these birds evolved their flightlessness independent of each other. So this means that, let's look at the picture of all of these. We'll just pick I'll pick the ostrich, and number 5 is, I can't pronounce that, but they were called the terror birds of South America. They evolved independent from each other. What that means is the most common ancestor to the ostrich and the terror bird, their most recent common ancestor was not also flightless. Their most recent common ancestor would have had flight, right? So as different birds migrated to different land masses, and birds can do that easily because they can fly, different species of birds separately evolved down lines where this branch became flightless, this branch maintained their wings, right? So some of these birds do share a common ancestor that was flightless, but the majority of them actually got that totally independently from each other. We've looked at sugar gliders, flying squirrels, and colugos before too. These are gliding mammals. One of these is a marsupial, the sugar glider, which is on the top left here. So it has a pouch closely related to kangaroos. The bottom left is a flying squirrel. It is a type of squirrel. It's a rodent, right? Totally different, placental mammal. The colugo, we don't really know what kind of mammal it is. It really doesn't have, we're not sure yet what its most close relative is. We'll have to do a lot more DNA testing to figure that out. But each of them glides with a giant set of webbing between their arms and their legs. Three-toed skinks, they've lost their legs. I'm sorry, they haven't completely lost their legs. They just have really tiny, useless legs. They can't use them to move around or for locomotion. They slither about like snakes do, and eventually they will completely mimic what snakes do, because we know that snakes used to have tiny little legs that were no good for walking. You can find fossils of that. There's a video on PBS Eons that goes over the evolution of snakes and how they lost their legs. So these guys eventually will lose them too, and they'll be just like snakes in that way, but they won't be snakes. They'll technically still be a kind of lizard. Sharks and ichthyosaurs. So dolphins, mammals, if you look at mammal skeletons, this is going to be kind of a weird example, but mammals move, how do I do this? By moving their spine up and down, right? So like you bend forward. That's the range of flexibility you have. If you look at I'll try to find one and embed it here. If you find a GIF of like a cheetah running, you can see that it sort of slinkies its body together, right? Where it brings both its hind legs at the same time way up beyond its front legs, and then it stretches out. Now, if you look at a lizard or a crocodile or really any kind of reptile, the way they move, they have a side-to-side locomotion where they bring the hind leg on the left side close up to the front leg on the right side, and then vice versa. So they waddle back and forth kind of. And fish do that too. Fish swim by by sort of flexing their body left to right. So sharks and ichthyosaurs both they move the same way, side to side, but then they each independently got large dorsal fins, large tail flukes, and pectoral fins. But the common ancestor of them lived 400 million years ago, an extremely long time ago. Yet, we see that they each got extremely similar body plans, totally independent of one another. And furthermore, we know for a fact that ichthyosaurs changed their body plan over evolutionary time. If we look at this picture, the ichthyosaurs on the top are the oldest fossils of them. We can see they don't yet have the dorsal fin at all. The pectoral fins are not very large, and their tail fluke is not very large. And gradually over time, nature selected for having a big dorsal fin because it keeps you stable, large pectoral fins, and a large tail fluke. Another one, the flounder fish. This is a fish that is turning its body sideways. As a larva, they actually look like regular fish with eyes on either side of their head. But as they become adults, their skeleton changes, and the growth of their skull changes so dramatically that it brings both eyes to the same side of their body. For some, it's the left, others, it's the right. And this mimics what rays do, right? So like stingrays and fish like that. They're copying flat fishes, but they're technically not a flat fish, right? Because they're just not, right? So here's what a flounder looks like as an adult. And the top of the fish in this picture is its like backside, right? That's its spine. That's the top of the animal, and the bottom is the belly. Although you look at the way its eyes are, and it looks like the broad side is the top, and the side we can't see is the bottom. But no, that's not the case. And you can further tell that by looking at its mouth. Its mouth cannot turn sideways. Its mouth stays in the original position. So I just have a whole bunch of pictures of other examples, and then we'll wrap up. This is what's called a phytosaurus. Or a phytosaur, sorry. It's not a crocodile. It's just that it looks a lot like a crocodile. It's a completely different kind of reptile. They're extinct. The group of them was called the phytosaurs. This is I don't remember what it's called. I think it's a termite mimicking beetle. But it's so incredibly bizarre. You really can't tell in the actual picture on the right here, but the illustration shows the whole top-down view. Those things that look like antennas, those things that look like legs, are not antennas or legs. They're non-functional. They're simply random outgrowths of this beetle's butt, right? It grows this enormous, lumpy, massive tissue, and it basically droops it over its body so that it can look like termites, mimic termites, go into termite mounds and not be attacked, and it steals resources from them. It's wearing its Halloween costume all the time, and it's such an amazing thing. This looks just like an ant, but it's not an ant. It's a different type of beetle, an ant mimicking beetle. We have hummingbird moths here in California. They had them also in South Dakota where I used to live. So they're insects, right? They're not birds at all, but they can fly forwards and backwards like hummingbirds can. They have the large, it's not a beak, it's their, I don't know what you call that in an insect actually, but it specializes on feeding on small plants with sort of deep pits to them to get the nectar out of them, just like hummingbirds do. These are some pretty funny examples. The top is what's called a marsupial mole. It's not a mole, it's a marsupial, but it lives underground. It has really giant front hands and really big sort of nails for digging around. Its eyes are completely covered with fur. You don't see its ears either. It's totally adapted to living underground, but it's a marsupial. There's a mole cricket, right? So this is an insect. It has wings, you can see them, but it can't fly with them. And its front legs are really broad and large for scooping out and living underground, as they do. And then there's the regular mole, right, which is a placental mammal. Excellent examples of convergent evolution. The spiky mammals, the echidna, the hedgehog, and that's the South American porcupine. I picked that one because they have shorter quills instead of the really long ones like North American porcupines have. But they don't share a common ancestor that was also spiky. They evolved this completely independent of each other. I think hedgehogs are native to Africa. The South American porcupine is South America, and echidnas only live in Australia. So they each got spikes independent of each other. This is called the fossa, and they live in Madagascar. You look at its face and its body, and it looks so much like some sort of cat, but they're not cats at all. They're closely related to mongooses, actually. And again, an example of convergent evolution. The African civet, I really don't remember what kind of mammals they're closely related to, but it looks just like a raccoon in many ways, but they're not all that closely related. The greater auk, those went extinct in the 1800s. I think we shot all of them, which is what we tend to do. Now they're flightless aquatic birds, but they developed flightlessness and an aquatic lifestyle independent of one another. This is actually another marsupial. It's thylacosmilene or something like that. I'll put the actual name of it down here somewhere. And it was a saber-toothed, cat-like looking mammal, but it wasn't a cat. So on the bottom right is the Smilodon on the top and the thylacosmilene or whatever it was on the bottom. These ones weirdly had bony outgrowths on their mandible that covered and protected their saber teeth, which is probably actually a pretty good design. So it has kind of a weird, ugly sort of face. You can see it's got like a domed skull that goes way forward. Pretty different, but again, it's not a true cat. It's a marsupial type animal. And the final example, not just to pick on animals, this is a banana plant. The bananas don't grow on trees. This is actually a bush or a shrub. I think it's a bush, technically. But it mimics what trees do, right? It grows vertically. It's got the large fronds, kind of like a palm tree does, but it's not a tree, right? So there is convergent evolution in other places beyond just animals. I just don't happen to know all that much about plants. So that is it for this. That is it for chapter 17. I hope you enjoyed all the little lessons we did on this, and I hope you're taking care of yourself. Have a great day.